One of the questions that comes up over and over again when talking about the war of 1948 and 49 is how was the Palestinian refugee problem created? For those of you who might have grown up Jewish, there was a certain narrative that we all got as kids. And then there was a lot of historical evidence that was released both by the Israeli government and the British government in the 1980s that added more nuance and complexity to that story. So in this chapter, we're really going to dive in and try to understand what was the source of the creation of the Arab refugee problem. The 1948-49 war created a refugee problem for the Arabs of Palestine. While different narratives tend to place the blame for this problem with one side or the other, a close look at the history shows that there are multiple reasons for the creation of this refugee problem. During the 1948-49 war, there were three major things that happened to the Arabs of Palestine. First, there were Arab Palestinians who fled, seeking out different locations where they could wait out the war safely. Second, there were Arab Palestinians who were convinced to flee because of the neighboring Arab countries that were disseminating misinformation. These first two categories of people amounted to approximately 700,000 people, and they became refugees living in the West Bank and Gaza, then controlled by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, or they ended up in a nearby border area of other Arab countries that were close to Israel. There was also a third group of Arab Palestinians who stayed during the war and ended up on the Israeli side of the new border. Those 150,000 to 160,000 Arabs were granted Israeli citizenship. What is curious about these populations is that they were not accepted into the other Arab countries, even the ones with large Palestinian populations. Rather, they are given refugee status, and they were kept in a state of perpetual limbo. One exception to this was Jordan, which annexed the West Bank. The Palestinian Arabs there were granted citizenship in Jordan, and yet were nevertheless still considered refugees. But why were so many Palestinian Arabs not absorbed by other Arab countries? There are many who argue that the purpose of maintaining the refugee status was and is to use Palestinians as a wedge against the state of Israel. Others argue that they were kept as refugees because of the eventual hope of creating a Palestinian state where they could return. Still others point out that other Arab countries did not want to increase their own Palestinian populations. And the truth is that all three of these answers contain some elements of truth. It is also worth mentioning that in 1949, a unique refugee organization, UNRWA, was founded. UNRWA is the only UN refugee organization devoted to one specific refugee population. The organization over the years has been criticized for defining Palestinian refugees as any Palestinian who was displaced in 1948 and their descendants, including those who have already been resettled in other countries and have even acquired citizenship elsewhere. In addition to the approximately 700,000 Arab refugees that were created during the War of Independence, in the next 2 to 4 years that followed, somewhere between 850,000 and 1 million Jews fled or were kicked out of Arab and Islamic countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Some 650,000 of them came to Israel. These Jewish communities are often called collectively Mizrahim. This huge influx of Mizrahi Jews changed the very ethnic makeup and the culture of this new fledgling state. They brought with them customs and food culture from the areas where they had lived for centuries. I often get questions about why Israeli food is different from what has been considered classic Jewish food by people most familiar with Ashkenazi food traditions, foods like lox and bagels, challah, and brisket. So why do Israelis eat food like falafel and hummus and shawarma? Part of it is that when European Jews moved to the District of Palestine, they adopted the local food culture. But another important reason is that these Mizrahi Jews brought with them the language, culture, and food norms that were highly influenced by Arab culture, much in the same way that Ashkenazi Jews brought European food culture with them. So I realize that there's a lot of information in this chapter, but the key thing that we're trying to land on is to understand that no one side can claim the total ownership of the creation of a refugee problem. There are both examples of Jewish refugees and of Arab Palestinian refugees. Furthermore, who is to blame for the creation of the Arab refugee problem is more complicated than some of the old talking points we learned in the Jewish community when I was a kid, and they're much more complicated than some of the talking points given by Israel detractors today. In the next chapter, we're just going to try to connect the dots between the end of the 1948-49 war and the next major event, which is the Six-Day War in 1967. This period of time between 1949 and 1967 isn't the most interesting period of time, but I want to make sure that you have some of the important details to connect you through.